If you'd like to open your Bible up to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Now, I joke at the beginning, I know we always have a bigger crowd Christmas time and Easter time for whatever reason. I'm really glad you're here. If this is the one Sunday you're here, I'm glad you're here instead of somewhere else, and glad you're a part of this. I will tell you that when you come Christmas and Easter, you miss the best parts of the story in between. And there's each year what we generally do is we'll talk about the birth of Christ at Christmas time, and then we will go through one of the Gospels between then and Easter to talk about the life of Christ and all the things He has done. And so if you happen to have visited on Christmas and you're here again for the end of the story, you can find everything in between online. You can go to YouTube, search us. You can find the quick hit version of Matthew that we have done on Sunday mornings here, or you can find the more detailed version of the Gospel of Mark that Jeff has been doing in his class, and you can learn the whole story because there's a lot of good there, and we'd love for you to learn that. Secondly, generally on a Sunday, I will tell a lot of stories in the course of a sermon, and it is hard to top the story that we're going to tell. And so this is not really how I normally speak. I'd love to have you come back again sometime and hear a little more of what's normal here, but we're going to look at the story of Jesus at the end of His life and His resurrection because it is the best story that has been told. And we will begin that in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 56. It says that this had taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled, and then all the disciples left Him and fled. This has always been one of the most painful verses for me to read as I go through this story because it sets the tone for what's going to happen to come here, that Jesus is alone. Now, there are times where you relish being alone. There are times where being alone is the one thing you wish you could find. You're surrounded by people, you're around a crowd, and just the idea of being off by yourself just sounds glorious. And then there are other times where you really need people walking alongside you. You need people who understand what you're going through. You need people to bear some of that burden with you. And Jesus is at one of those times where to have those people alongside Him would be so beneficial, and yet they have all turned and they've run. And He finds Himself alone having to go through the things that He's about to have to deal with. So the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put Him to death. So my question is, are they looking for truth? I think the way Matthew describes this makes it pretty clear that they're not really all that interested in truth. And maybe you have seen this kind of thing in life too, where it seems like the people around you, it seems like maybe the powers that be are not interested in what is true, but just interested in what they can manipulate to make the thing they want to happen, happen. Or maybe you have felt like you're on the wrong side of that somewhere along the way, where everything seems to be stacked against you. And so these religious leaders, they're not looking for truth, they're not looking to learn, they're not looking to discover, they are looking to make things happen in the way they want things to happen. And again, as we have read about all these different religious leaders throughout the Gospel of Matthew, I think there are times where we can probably read and feel just a little bit uncomfortable with ourselves. Because how often do we as people want to manipulate things in such a way that the outcome we're looking for is what comes about? We're not necessarily looking for truth in it. We're not looking for what God would have us to do in things, but oftentimes we are looking to make things happen the way we want them to happen. And these folks are no different. They are wanting to set things in motion to get the result that they're looking for. So it says there as He's being questioned that Jesus remained silent in verse 63. And the high priest said to Him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So from now on, this is what you're going to see. And Jesus helps them to see that as much as they're trying to grab control, as much as they're trying to manipulate, notice His wording here. He doesn't say that somewhere off in the future, this is what's going to happen. From now on, what is happening is exactly what is supposed to happen. You're not the ones in control here trying to judge, trying to manipulate. I have control over this situation. Because like we just sung a few minutes ago, He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have changed the course of what was going to happen, and He doesn't. And you look at all of this, and the one with the real power to manipulate the situation, the one with the real power to cause whatever He wants to happen, He doesn't do that. He instead allows everybody to think they have this false control of moving situations in the way they want them moved, and what's actually happening is what God had planned all along. And maybe at times in our lives, we try desperately to grab hold of control and to make things move in the way we want them to move, and we forget the fact that God has been sovereign all along. It's God that's in control. And if we could just bring ourselves to let loose of that, to let go, and to allow him to do what he's going to do, we could instead participate in that instead of fighting against it. So what is your judgment? They answered, he deserves death. And they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him. And by the way, if you haven't figured this out already, we're going to skip along a little bit within the story. We've looked at quite a bit of it during our communion time through the words at the beginning, and we're going to skip through some of those points today. He deserves death. They spit in his face, and they struck him, and some slapped him. I want you to think for a moment about the idea of them spitting in his face. I don't know that there's a whole lot more insulting thing you could do to someone than spitting in their face. If you're a baseball fan, you may remember, 10 or 15 years ago, there was an incident where a player spit on another person there in the game. And there was uproar that came with that. The player tried to deny it at first, and then for whatever reason didn't realize there's all these different angles and slow motion and all, and it became pretty clear that's what he had done. Could you imagine Jesus here before us, of all the things we may want to do, to ask, to interact with Jesus, to spit in his face? This is their answer. And as you think of his face being spit on, I want you to think for a moment of when is the time where you have heard about Jesus spitting anywhere. What immediately comes into my head is John 9. We referenced this a week or two ago. In John 9, he runs across this blind man on the road. And this man is there, and him and his disciples are having this conversation. His disciples assume this is the result of someone's sin. Jesus explains it's not that, but God's going to be shown in all of this. And then in the midst of that story, he spits on the ground. He makes mud, he puts this on this guy's face and tells him to go and wash. And I think to myself, think of how spit is used in these two instances. In the one, the idea of mocking and offending and insulting. And for Jesus, how does he use it? Healing in a completely different way. And this will not be the first time in this story that we will see multiple times that Jesus is going to take something that others would use and use it in a very different kind of way. So when morning came in chapter 27, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. I think for a moment of him being bound. I go back in my mind to that story of Samson being bound and about how Delilah tries to get out of him. What is it that can bind you? And he tells her all these false stories, and he keeps breaking the bindings. What can you bind God with? I mean, what kind of rope would it take? What kind of chains would you need to bind the one who could call the legions of angels? To bind the one who can make the blind see, to blind the one who can bring the dead back to life, to blind the one who could take leprosy and take it away. Do you think there is a kind of rope that they could bind him with that he could not immediately break, make disappear, make none of those things happen in the first place, however he miraculously wanted to handle it? And again, they feel like they have this all under control, and at any moment, Jesus could change the course of this. But he goes on and continues. Now Jesus, down in verse 11, stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." He's the king. This is not how you treat a king, is it? This idea of him being a king all throughout this, the way he's led, the way he is mocked, the way he's tortured, there is something about him that allows him to keep doing these things. And I think we know what that is. It's a combination of things. It's the love that sent him into the world in the first place. The love for us, the love for creation, the love for his people. It is the obedience to God that says, even though he is a king, he's going to allow these people to do what they're doing. So there is this king that is recognized. Now in verse 15 it says, "At the feast of the governor, it was a custom to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted." And so we know the story. If you've heard this story before, if you're unfamiliar with it, there's this man Barabbas. This man Barabbas is in prison. We don't know a whole lot about him, but what we do know is he is a violent revolutionary who should be in prison. According to their law, that's where he belongs. And so Pilate comes up with this plan. He looks at Jesus and he doesn't see anything worthy of death. At the same time, he sees all these people who are right on the verge of out of control, and so he doesn't want to just release him. So here's this thing they would normally do, and the design of this thing generally was to appease the crowd. Let's give them one person back. And so he puts before them Barabbas, this insurrectionist, this man of violence, and Jesus, who is about as far to the opposite of that as you can get. Someone who a lot of people along the way was going to take things by force, was going to take over, and he never did. And Pilate puts these two before them, probably thinking, choice is pretty obvious here, isn't it? You've got this one man who just seems as innocent as can be. You've got another man who is clearly guilty, and who are they going to choose? And the choice is not what Pilate anticipates. Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." And again, now here we see that they are shouting. And they shouted for his crucifixion. I want you to think back in the story the last time we saw shouting taking place in the story. And if you go back to the beginning of this week, he is coming into Jerusalem and they are shouting, "Hosanna." They're worshiping. They're laying down palms before him as he goes through the crowd. And this shouting that was just this incredible acknowledgement of who he is, that had been waited for so long, now has turned in the complete opposite direction. And we see this in our world far too often too, don't we? There are times where the idea of Jesus seems very welcome. There are things about Jesus that even people who are not religious people really like about him. This idea of loving other people, we like that. This idea of serving, this idea of not judging, all those things, we like those things. But other things about Jesus are much more difficult. And now they have come to a point where the shouting has turned. And the shouting is no longer about worship, but now the shouting is asking for his life. Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. And then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. So they took Jesus now. And this word to me is kind of interesting too. The word took that is used here in the Greek is paralambano, kind of a fun word to say. Paralambano is used in reference to Jesus two other times in the Gospel of Matthew. One, if you go all the way back to chapter 2, if you'd been here at Christmas time, if that was the other time you may have been here, we talked about this way back then. Jesus is born. Herod wants all those babies dead because he doesn't want the threat to him. And so this angel comes to Joseph and warns him about this, and he took Jesus to Egypt to protect him. And so the first time we see Jesus taken somewhere, he is protected by that being taken. The next time we see it come is in Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 4, another familiar story, even if you're not a church person around these stories a lot, you've probably heard about the temptation of Jesus. And when Jesus is tempted by the devil, at one point he is taken by the devil to another location. And here we find that word again. So initially in chapter 2, he's taken to be protected, and then he is taken to be tempted. And now here he is taken to be killed. Jesus is not taken often, but when he is, there is something very significant going on. So he's taken here to be killed. It says in verse 28 that they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and twisted together a crown of thorns. They put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews." And they spit on him again and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. Is it not enough to have your freedom taken? Is it not enough to be bound? Is it not enough to be taken and led places you don't want to go? But now they mock him. And they mock him in so many different ways. They mock him by what they call him. They mock him by what they make him wear. They mock him by fashioning this crown of thorns and putting it down on his head and the pain that comes with that. And at each turn, he's going to be mocked. We're going to find him again, by the way, on the cross. And he is going to be mocked there as well. That mocking goes on and on and on. And I wonder for you, if you have been mocked in life somewhere along the way, and I will guarantee you, by the way, it did not rise to the level of what Jesus is experiencing here, but if you have been mocked, how much does it take before you lash out? How many times do you have to be mocked? How many times does that mocking have to escalate before you have finally had enough? And even if you are not a violent person, even if you're not a confrontational person, you have had enough and you lash out. I mentioned probably months ago now, the one time I got into a fight in elementary school, it was over mocking. And I finally reached that day that nonviolent pacifist Brian in 5th grade had enough and lashed out. And Jesus goes through all of this at any moment, having the power to do anything to stop it or to do anything to any of the people doing it. And he doesn't. He just continues to take it for you and for me and for obedience to the Father. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. And then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God,' and the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way." They all mocked him. Even the guys who had it as bad on either side of him, even they mocked him. Even these religious leaders who are supposed to be the pious among everybody, they're supposed to be the ones who lead people closer to God. Even they continue the mockery of him. And it's not enough that they feel like they've won. It's not enough that the example is hanging there in front of them. They continue to mock. So Jesus cried out in verse 50. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. And then when the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." This was the Son of God. Think of all the people that we have encountered in the story between Matthew 26 and now. His disciples, those people that were alongside him for years. We've seen all these different religious leaders. We've seen people in the Roman government. We've seen all these different soldiers come along, people who have followed at a distance. We learn in the midst of all this that the bravest among his followers seem to be the women. They are there following a little bit at a distance. They're going to show up again in a moment. And in the midst of all of that, where does the confession of who he actually is come from? The centurion. And what you will find in the story of Jesus is if you take it at its word, and I do, and I believe the people who are gathered here do, because if this were not true, there would somewhere in Israel this morning be a place that is a tourist mecca for everyone, that is the tomb of Christ, and there would still be bones there. And people would look at that. It would probably be behind plexiglass of some kind so no one gets too close, and there would be ropes in front. There are, if you go to Israel today, multiple tombs because different people have decided they found the right one. But the thing they have in common is there is no one there. That tomb is empty. And we recognize the same thing that the centurion recognized. This is the Son of God. And when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. And this rich man, Joseph, has a tomb. And it all happens as it was prophesied in the Old Testament, that this rich man would come with this new tomb, and he takes the body of Jesus, and they place him in the tomb. And even that is not enough, by the way. It should be. But people remember, they've told this story about how he would rise. Let's place guards in front of that tomb, and we'll place a heavy stone there just to make sure. We want to make sure that none of his followers come and steal the body and then tell the story that there's been a resurrection. And so we will make absolutely sure we have full control over this, and he will remain there in the tomb until the end of time. Now, after the Sabbath, in chapter 28, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And I believe this is a time of sadness. We look at Matthew 28, if you're familiar with it, and there's a lot of happiness in the story. But when you go to the cemetery for the first time, that is not a happy time, is it? When you have been there and your loved one has been buried and you go back for the first time to visit, maybe you go back to see the tombstone that has finally been put in place. Maybe there's some times of memories that make you smile. But generally, getting out of the car, walking toward that tomb, it's not a happy time. My uncle is buried down in the National Cemetery in Dallas. I remember taking David there for the first time when he was a little guy. And when we walked to the tomb, we walked to the graveside there. It's not a happy time. I told him stories about my uncle and all of that, but when I got there, there was that moment of finality, of seeing that tombstone there. When they're going to the tomb, they are not expecting what's going to happen. They've heard the stories, they've heard what Jesus said, but they don't get it yet. They're going there to do the jobs that have to be done, to get the body ready for being there forever. And so they go to the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came back and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing as white as snow. And for the fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified." And that same thing that is said at the very beginning of the story is said here again. Do not fear. This angel shows up with an earthquake and lightning and brightness and all of that, so much so that these brave soldiers are gone, and here are these ladies. And he says to them, do not fear. He is not here, for he is risen as he said. Come see the place where he lay. He has risen. Is there any more amazing story that you can think of than that? This one who everybody felt like they've controlled the situation. They finally put an end to this uprising, this group, this sect. We won't have to deal with them anymore. We have finally showed them who is in charge. And they have put him in the tomb and placed this giant stone there and put guards in front of it. And they said, we have won. It is over. It is done. And now that tomb is empty. The one who is there is gone. He is risen. And it is just as he said. And because of that, you and I have the hope of the same thing. You and I can follow him. We can confess his name the way that centurion did. We can be baptized into his family, and we can live with him forever. And that is the best news of Easter. If you have not followed him before, this could be the day that your new life begins. You can follow him, and your tomb is just a temporary place. And though your body may be there, you will be raised to walk in a new life with him. Or if you have fallen away from that, and you have allowed life to get in the way, or you felt like maybe you've been able to manipulate situations and do things in the way you would want them, know that God is still in control, and God still wants you to be with him. If there's some way we can help you as your church family this morning to grow closer to him and to follow him for the first time, please come while we stand and sing.